Thank you. Thank you. Let's get this session started. We have a lot of great content, so want to make sure we get through it. Good morning. This is the session on connecting the dots and why micromobility is important for first and last mile. So if this is not the session you wanted to hear, then you're in the wrong room. My guests, which all are lined up like professional football coaches, all join us from south of the border, from California, so the hotbed of micromobility. My name is Sandra Phillips. If you don't know me, I'm the CEO and founder of MoveMe, Shared Transportation Services. We're focused on shared mobility architecture, which essentially means we don't build houses, but we build shared mobility services. We're focused only on shared services, so we have launched car sharing in, can't even remember how many cities, but Vancouver, Dubai, Honolulu are some, but also micromobility services in Brooklyn, New York, here in Vancouver. And currently we're working with TransLink, the local transit authority, on connecting the dots between shared mobility services and the public transit. I'd like to acknowledge that Vancouver is located on the unceded indigenous territories belonging to the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. Now this session is split in 3 blocks. First, I will just give you kind of a high level, set the stage overview of what we're discussing. Then our 4 panelists and experts will share some of their insights and learnings from different markets. And then last, but certainly not least, we have about 40 minutes of discussion. For that, we really would like you to participate, and we set up Slido. So if you haven't used Slido, here's how to do it. Go to slido.com, slido.com. Enter the event code Railvolution 2019. Then an event pops up called Rail-Volution Vancouver. Select that. And then select the Slido room 9, 10 a.m. connecting the dots. And then you can ask questions. All right. So micromobility, why should we care? So historically, the only option to owning your personal vehicle was public transit. But this has been changing fast, and collectively, we all have changed how transportation looks like in our cities. One of the latest additions is micromobility, so e-bikes, bikes, e-mopeds, or e-scooters that are shared. Now, micromobility has seen an explosive growth in the past 2 years. 2017 was the year of the dockless bike share. Remember, OFO, Lime is still around, Mobike, they all came on the scenes. And then in 2018, it really was the year of the kick scooter. McKinsey released a report earlier this year stating that over $5.7 billion have been invested into micromobility worldwide. Now that's a lot of money that's on the line to make this a success. So why should we care? Well, I think first of all, because we're finally right-sizing the vehicle. The vehicle size matches the number of passengers and the distance traveled. Micromobility, one of the keys of the definition of micromobility is that it's less than 100 kilograms. Number of passengers, maximum of 2 if you have an e-moped, which is great news. We all know it's like 1.1, 1.2 average for your personal vehicle driving around. And then the last one is the distance traveled. So free-floating car sharing and ride-hailing on average travel somewhere between 8 and 10 kilometers. Well, that's really a distance that where an e-bike or an e-moped could serve us just as well. And it would lead to the second reason why we should care, because it minimizes greenhouse gas emissions if you have clean energy. Even if you don't have clean energy, it reduces noise pollution in your city. Now, the third one, and this is really where this session comes from, it helps us connect the dots between public transit and where I'm from. So it truly allows for multimodal journeys. David Zipper, I'm sure you all know David Zipper, recently argued that if we could increase the catchment area to 2.4 kilometers around the transit stop, we would make transit accessible to 9 times as many people as we currently do with the 300 to 800 meter transit stop radius. So this is the good news. What we'll be discussing today, and what we should scrutinize to 3S, is how do we create sustainable services? One of the things we have seen as MoveMe, we poll every year 20 cities and look at how attractive they are for shared mobility services. And one of the things we have seen is that cities move away from a wait-and-see stance to a more activist approach. 5 years ago, we reviewed a handful of policies around shared services. Last year, we looked at over 250 for 20 cities. So, how do we make sure that these policies are also sustainable for the businesses? I don't know if you know what Madrid has done. Madrid has 22 kick scooters companies approved as of April this year. They have a cap of 10,000 vehicles. So these 22 companies have a maximum of 10,000 vehicles they can operate, which really makes it financially almost impossible for the operator to run their business. And from a consumer perspective, it's a nightmare because now you have 22 apps. Danielle Harris, Director of Mobility Innovation with Elemental Accelerator, will share some of her learnings on the topic of how do we work together with businesses and government in regulations. The second topic is what are the success metrics? So what is success now that we have all these new forms of mobility in our cities? And we have Diego Canales, who is the Global Partnership Manager of Populous AI, sharing some of their learnings dealing with data of these new mobility providers. And then the last topic is how do we ensure social equity and access across all demographics? Because we're dealing with private businesses who have very different mandates and objectives, and they're driven largely by VC money. And we have two people sharing some of their insights. One, we have Clarissa from Transform. She's the new Mobility Policy Director, and she comes from the heart of the Micromobility Revolution from San Francisco. She will share some of their learnings. And then we also have Jonathan Kalmus, CEO of Cosmic, who will share some of his learnings about the unbanked and underserviced communities in Latin America. So with that, I will shut up now and hand over to Danielle to share her insights.
All right, good morning. Thank you so much for having me. This is a great opportunity. So just some background on me. I've basically been with Elemental Accelerator for 2 months now. Previous to that, I was the innovation strategist for San Francisco. I had been with San Francisco for about 9 years. So I like to say I went from being Jon Snow to being Tyrion Lannister. I'll explain that more later. All right. So what is Elemental Accelerator? We're basically a nonprofit accelerator. We got about 800 applications of startups that want to do projects in communities, and we're really focused on impact, and that's impact for climate resiliency and promoting clean tech. And so we take about 15 to 20 companies every year into our cohort, and we really shape them and teach them how to work with cities, utilities, and corporates, and really promote climate resiliency in neighborhoods and promote the technology itself. And so we're headquartered in Honolulu, Hawaii, and we're really focused on helping Hawaii meet its sustainability goals. So that's 100% clean ground transportation by 2045, getting carbon neutral by 2045. So these are some pretty aggressive goals that are in Hawaii. And just so you know, Hawaii has really expensive energy based on its geographic location. And so that's why we started there. And then 2 years ago, we started in California and helping California reach their goals, specifically in marginalized, resilient communities. And so all of the projects that happen in California are specifically for communities. And so the way that we do this is we work proactively with nonprofits like Greenlining and Transform. We also have a policy arm, so we're going to the state legislature, working with local officials, as well as we have a number of STEM programs. So we're really cultivating a space for innovation first, very proactively, and then working to introduce startups into that deal flow. So we work with startups in 3 different ways. We have the demonstration track, which is focused on pulling off projects, and we give startups up to $1 million. We have go-to-market, which is basically coaching, and then we have equity and access, which is those California projects. The reason why I bring this up is because a lot of what Elemental Accelerator does is we focus on relationships. And so I moved there to become Tyrion Lannister because I would get to continue to work with policymakers. I get to continue to work with nonprofits. And most of all, I get a more insightful hand in working with startups and shaping them, as well as understanding their investors. So I'm sharing a table with all the players in hopes of moving the needle forward and making our cities smart. So just an overview, we have 82 companies in our portfolio. We're about to announce our next cohort at the end of September. And we've had a number of very successful companies that have had exits. So why am I here today? Basically, tech is not, these shiny new tools and toys are not the answer. They're not the silver bullet. I think a lot of great things have come from Silicon Valley. I would say many of us in this room would not be here if it was not for the companies that brought new innovation and new lenses to our industry. I think when I originally said I was becoming a planner, my mom was like, so you're doing wedding planning? And so I think many of us as planners, we really decided, yeah, we're going to write a 20-year plan and maybe something will be implemented within our lifetime. And I believe that tech has really changed that game where we're starting to see our projects implemented within months. And that's really what has made this so exciting for me. But I want to talk about kind of the soft and squishy, the fuzzy stuff, and really talk about relationships and what I learned being Jon Snow at the SFMTA, working with the companies, bringing those wildlings across the wall, and figuring out a way for us to work together to really fight our White Walkers, which I like to think of as SOVs. So I'm sorry for all of you that missed out on Game of Thrones. But I hope that I encourage all of you to watch and commit those many, many hours of your life. So basically climate change. This is why we need change. We need change and we need it now. It's basically the difference between winning and losing. And so we can continue to proliferate the overpopulation of cars and continue to have the noise, pollution, congestion, traffic fatalities. Or we can focus on winning, which is basically getting an alternative. And it's really as basic as that. I think we know many of us are stuck in traffic on a regular basis to do our work commute. I think our work commute indicates a number of things for us, such as the longer your commute, the less happy that you are. I think I feel that way as I'm starting a new commute with this new job. I also would say that most of these commutes happen in marginalized communities that are suffering and receiving a lot of the greenhouse gas emissions that are creating a massive amount of asthma for young populations. And so I think really we don't have time. I think we've seen all of the climate reports that have come out, and the ice caps are melting and the polar bears have nowhere to go, but most of all, our communities are suffering. So let's talk about change. I think change is gradual. I think anytime you start with somebody, I like to equate disruption to the last concert on the last night of Coachella. Sometimes it's a crazy show. I don't know what's in your system, but it's probably a lot. And you meet somebody, right? And so that's not really the ideal place to find a mate, but we're just gonna make it work, okay? And so that's really what disruption is to me, is you're just like, we're gonna hope this goes well, but we all are aware that it could go terribly wrong. And so commitment takes some time, and I think that's what's really the challenge here, is that many cities and companies are trying to figure out what is the right footing to take the next step after Coachella, right? Are we going to just slide in the DMs? Are we going to go on dates? Is it coffee? And so that's where pilot permits come into place. and really figuring out what is the right rules for our relationship, right? Like, maybe I don't want you to sleep over yet, or maybe we just do dinner, or maybe I don't even want to take you to lunch, let's just do coffee, right? And so that's really talking about the different amount of, like, a cap on vehicles, right? Or saying that you can only operate in certain areas. So that's what I mean by commitment. The other part is communication. I think it's very easy to say all the things that you don't want, right? But you can say, I hate when you leave your dishes in the sink, right? Or you could say, honey, can you please put your dishes in the dishwasher, or wash them, or put them in the cabinet and dry them off nicely, right? And so I think as cities, it's kind of common nature to talk about all the things that we don't want. It took me 6 months to change a sign from saying no parking, no stopping, to just saying passenger loading, right? Tell the companies what you do want. Don't focus on the things that you don't want. And I think figuring out what you do want is very difficult. It takes a lot of thought and a lot of dreaming, and I would say that our cities aren't necessarily the best at dreaming after many, many years of focusing on regulation and having control. The next thing is ridership. I think many, many transit agencies are really focused on the downward turn of ridership. And I think this is called the messy middle. The messy middle is where we want free car storage, and we want to play with all the many, many toys at the curb, and we want to have all of it all at once, right? And so eventually, there's going to be a slide, a shift, a mode shift. And to expect that shift to go from SOVs to transit is very overzealous, maybe too much dreaming for our cities. And so ridership, yes, will decline. And so what are you going to do to get that ridership back, right? And then the next thing, companies think that cities are really slow and don't know how to change the street. They also don't understand the amount of time and capital and public engagement that it takes to change the street, to remove parking, to remove a lane. And so I think there's a need for empathy on both sides, for companies to understand the pain of doing street design and the pain of lost ridership. And so we're going to have to learn together. The next thing, this is Esther Perel. I'm a big fan of hers. She's a marriage counselor. She has a podcast. You should definitely check it out. She has a book called State of Affairs. And she's very focused on evolving individuals within a relationship. And so I bring this up to say we have a great opportunity to learn from each other. As I talked to the companies, my partner in crime, Warren Logan, and I sat and we talked with about 50 different companies in San Francisco. And we sat them down proactively. We reached out to them. I think in the past, companies are very used to cities reaching out to them to complain about the things that they're dropping on their streets or the things that they're doing. And starting that conversation in a neutral space was really beneficial for us. One, I learned that they have very, very little information about transportation in terms of technical expertise. For instance, I did outside lands. It takes about 80,000 people into Golden Gate Park in a residential area in San Francisco. I did that coordination with the marketing manager of Uber. And I actually learned a lot from him, and he really focused on communications in the app and on the street. And so I think there's a huge learning experience. And so that goes to the user experience. I would say transit agencies and DOTs aren't very focused on the user experience. But think about your phone as a platform. The street is a platform. And so what are you messaging on your street? And so I would say that the companies have learned a lot in how to message and to really create behavior shift. The next one is new perspectives. I think many of the companies that I sit with, one, I think I did a talk and one of the designers from Uber came up to me and he was like, safety, I never thought about the other people on the street. And I was like, oh my God. So there's a lot of different perspectives. And yes, these are young, nimble minds in their early 20s that are focused on one thing only. And I think that's part of being a startup. Being focused is really, really important. And so there's a lot of different perspectives that can be embraced. And I think the biggest part is having them all at the table and listening. The last one I have here is Title VI. I think we know many of these services initially do not help marginalized communities. I'm talking about Black and brown communities. I'm talking about low-income communities. I'm talking about those people that need accessible services. And so Title VI is something that we are all familiar with and making sure that things are provided in multiple languages. And so it's on cities to push those requirements onto the companies and to learn that they need to make that work. Next one. This is me again. And so learning together is really important. And so I just did a talk at NACDO yesterday talking about data sharing, and I would say that that's really the meat and potatoes that we're at today, and figuring out what that looks like. And I think that you need to focus, again, on what you want, and then talk with the companies. At San Francisco, I had 2 experiences where I created legislation with Chariot and Ford at the table. And then the second one was I created legislation, well, I advised on legislation with without the scooter companies. And often found that the legislation that was created in parity was actually more relevant and got me more of the outcomes that I wanted. Also, you need to experience the service that you're trying to regulate. You cannot regulate something that you do not understand. And I think many of us pride ourselves on being transportation purists and being transit only and walking only and biking only. But if you're going to introduce these new services that are truly alternatives to SOVs, you should try them out and understand them more thoroughly and have a conversation. And then I just bring special events. So special events is something that I worked on when I was in the Office of Innovation. And I brought Uber, Lyft, the scooter companies, moped company, all to the table to focus on how do we, one, just disperse the crowd. It did not matter to me who got what riders. The focus was just to disperse the crowd. And so we went from 2 hours of congestion in a residential neighborhood to 40 minutes. And the residents were very happy. So I think finding your common ground is really important. And then the last one, it's about people. I think when you think about disruption and how companies came in and they just dropped something on the street, and then cities got really, really mad, I think about my neighborhoods where people would come, cities would come and put their things on the street and never talk to my family. And so I think there's a lot to learn. And we both need to work on doing public engagement and doing equitable access and making sure that everybody is continually getting to the table. The next thing is hiring. I think we as DOTs and transit agencies can really focus on diversifying our hiring. In my last few months at the Office of Innovation, I really wanted to know more engineers or planners. I really wanted to figure out how I could hire more designers, getting to that user experience and behavior shift. And the same thing for companies. That was the #1 recommendation that I made to all the companies that we sat with is, I said, isn't this an enjoyable conversation that I can speak your language? And do you have someone that speaks government, someone that speaks policy? And so I think it's really important that we understand that there are multiple languages going across the table and making sure that you are well equipped to have those conversations in a robust and well-rounded way. And so with that, I think that we both can do better, and is really why I moved to the accelerator and away from government, to figure out what is the best way to move our cities forward in the mobility revolution. Thank you.
Thank you. So I work for Populous. A little bit about me. Well, first of all, thanks for having me here and for listening to this very interesting topic, which, as Sandra said, for the last year, it's been an explosion around micromobility. The last count we did worldwide about cities that had scooters was about 300 and plus cities around the world. Around 200 cities outside the US had scooters already within 1 year. So that's a crazy amount of numbers. I work for Populous. We're a third-party sharing platform. Basically, we are intermediate between the private sector and the public sector, where we help them get the data sharing between the private mobility companies and the public sector, so that we help governments, cities, transit agencies help the tough questions they need to answer, right, about these mobility services. So we see that basically the problem, or as I want to call it more, it's the challenge, is that we see an unprecedented rate of new mobility services for the last decade. So it started with car sharing probably 15 years ago with Zipcar, then Car2Go. It evolved from two-way to a one-way. Then we had ride-hailing. We have Uber, Lyft, Cabify, you name it, Get, number of mobility operators around the world. And then we began shifting towards bike sharing, dockless bike sharing, scooters, and so on. So basically the problem is that cities are in the dark when it comes about, okay, how are these mobility services basically changing the mobility patterns, the ridership, what's happening to my city with all this influx of new mobility companies. So, and we also know that cities are the only ones that have the ability basically to make planning and policy decisions about the public right of way. So with that, we are helping cities basically get the data they need to begin aligning the outcomes they want to see and the future they want to see for the city. So with all these mobility services, which basically had an explosion thanks to the smartphone, GPS, and so on, we have an influx of data about these services. And so cities have realized that they actually need all this data to begin looking at how the impact and whether these mobility companies are actually aligning to the goals that they have for the city. So we have identified that basically the three main goals that cities look for these mobility services are safety, whether they are increasing or reducing the transport-related injuries and fatalities. The second one is equitable access, whether they are improving the accessibility towards the transit systems or towards employment, towards housing, how are they shifting and how they're impacting low-income communities. And third one, it's in terms of efficiency, not only in terms of efficiency of the public use of space, but also efficiency of the energy use and whether they're contributing or actually making worse that transport climate impacts. So with this, we see that basically cities have, they need the data to begin informing their policies and figure out whether these mobility services are actually aligning towards the goals that they have. With that, we see that cities, after looking at what happened with ride-hailing, that they were not able to get at the beginning the data that they wanted to be able to figure out the impact. They saw that there was an opportunity in bike sharing and basically in scooters companies to begin asking data to evaluate what they wanted and they answer the questions that they had. So with that, we saw that they began asking these mobility companies about data. And the data that they're currently asking, it's about trips, so they ask about the number of trips, also vehicles, because they want to measure the vehicle caps. In many cases, the operating permits with these mobility services have a vehicle cap, so they want to know whether they're complying with that. Also maintenance logs, they want to know what's happening at the back end of these services, sometimes also to measure. I think one goal that cities want to measure is the life cycle of these vehicles, so how long are they in the streets and so on. So maintenance log helps them with that. Complaints. How are the general public, sometimes not users, feeling about these scooter companies or the scooters and whether they're addressing the complaints that the citizens have, and also the injuries. So this is aligned with the safety I said. All this data that's being requested, we see that there's been a trend in the industry in terms of the standards. There's two main standards that have emerged where cities are able to get the data from mobility companies. The first one is the GBFS, which is actually coming from, well, the GTFS started I think 2009, is the General Transit Fleet Specification, which actually digitized all the transit networks. And then it jumped to the bike sharing systems, right? So DOC bike sharing systems, they created their own standard, which is the General Bike Sharing Fleet Specification, which basically it's able to tell you in real time where do you have available services, available vehicles on the street. So that is data that cities are receiving. And lastly, the one called MDS, which stands for Mobility Data Specification. It's a standard that was built around a year ago by the city of Los Angeles DOT. They saw that they had a need to begin asking for more data on the back end about historic trips, so historic movement of vehicles. So they created the Mobility Data Specification with a goal of doing it for scooters, but they also have the end goal of going over ride-hailing and other modes to begin requesting data for that. As an example, Populous, we get this MDS data for scooters, but we have been able to work with MDS data for car sharing. So Lime has a service called Lime Pod in Seattle, and they're able to tweak the MDS to be able to fit their services. And so we were able to evaluate the car sharing system, one-way car sharing system in Seattle with the MDS standard specification. And lastly, not all the answers, not all the questions can be answered through GPS data. So we still need some traditional surveys about what is the impact, mainly asking about mode shift. So cities often require operators about, some surveys, standardized surveys to all the operators to begin figuring out, okay, what are the impacts? All these users that you have, are you actually driving them from SOVs? Or are you driving from transit or walking or cycling? So they want to begin understand this so that they can put policies in place that incentivize more drawing from SOVs rather than from other modes. I think a key slide is this one, which is that cities need information and KPIs. They don't need data for the sake of data. And we've seen that at the beginning there was a little bit of a backlash in that cities were asking all the data they could from these mobility services without really understanding what type of questions they would be answering, how they would use the data, what protection they would use on the data, on the user privacy. So with that conversations, which have been happening for the last year, the city policymakers and transport planners have been able to figure out key KPIs that they need to regulate, monitor, and also evaluate on the long-term impacts of these services. So some of the KPIs that we've seen that they have created aligned to this vision that they have for the transport is vehicle and fleet compliance. This is mainly for the vehicle permits, which, as Daniel said, they have vehicle caps. So they need to be able to measure, okay, how many vehicles are you putting in the streets? Are you complying with that? Also, utilization rates. So something that cities are very interested in is like, okay, how many trips are you getting on a per vehicle basis, daily? Equity analysis, and last, parking management is also something they're very interested in because they want to figure out whether they're behaving accordingly the way they want to, and whether they can begin doing some policies to begin shifting some, for example, parking car spots to begin putting for scooters. So we've seen that in some cities. And lastly, is being able to harness that data to figure out where can I put new infrastructure, where can I put new cycle lanes, and so on. I'm going to show a little bit of examples of the KPIs and how with a platform that we have, we've been able to create it, and we're able to measure the performance of these KPIs. So this is this is the vehicle cap. This is some graphs that we have where we show on an operator basis what is the vehicle caps that they have throughout the day. We can measure this through the day, the week, aggregate by the month, to whatever historic date we want to look back on. So the first time they give us data, we can go back and look at all the data. And here we can create metrics on trips, so average number of trips, monthly, weekly, on an operator basis. We can see that vehicle utilization, which is very important. Some regulations, some operating permits have a vehicle cap, but if you're able to demonstrate that you have above certain vehicle utilization rates, they're able to flexible and make more dynamic caps. So if you are able to reach more than 4 trips on a per vehicle basis, they give you more vehicles to put on the ground. So that's why they want to measure this, so that therefore you can put more vehicles because you're doing the right way in terms of like having them moved throughout the streets with users. We also have vehicle sizes, parking idle times. That's something also very important for cities, because sometimes when you see, and people complain about this, so when people see that a scooter or a bicycle has not been moved for like 10 hours, 12, 24, 40, people begin complaining, okay, what's happening with this bicycle? So we are able to measure that, and we can make issues and some tickets that we report back to the operator saying, hey, this vehicle that you have here has been idling for more than 24 hours, whatever the rule is. Geographic distribution of vehicles, which is part of the equity analysis. And also, as I said, this, you can see it with trends over time. No matter what historic date you want to look at, we are able to query that in our platform. We also were very concerned about the user protection and the user privacy, which is very important here. But for example, in Europe, they have what they call the GDPR, which is a privacy directive from the European Union. And we have to be very careful about how we treat this data, right? Because trip data and GPS trace data, even though it's anonymized, it can be traced back to the user if you do the right methodology and so on. So we put extra layers of security on top of that data. This is some of the analysis we've done. This was for the city of Washington, D.C., where they were interested about the equitable access of these mobility services throughout the city. So Washington, D.C. has 8 wards, and some are classified as low-income wards. And so what the city was asking these operator companies to do was, okay, I need you to at least have certain number of vehicles being deployed in these wards, or either number of vehicles or percentage of the fleet that you have has to be at least in the morning when you deploy them. So we're able to measure this, and we're able to get some metrics around that for the cities. Something, as I said, the parking management, I think this is very crucial, important. This is a heat map of all the parking events of the scooters for the county of Arlington, so neighbor of Washington, D.C. And we see that with this heat map, which cities can zoom in, they can begin looking, okay, where is a place in a city where I can incentivize and put dedicated parking spaces for the scooter and bicycle companies, right? So first of all, they can identify where they can put it, and so the dots that you see, the blue dots, are actually spaces, dedicated spaces that I have put in the infrastructure, just for, and I'll show a picture of that, where scooters can park. So after they do that, they go and communicate that, they design the policy, and they communicate to the operator. Because the operator then takes that, basically a polygon, put in the app, and they show it to the user. Hey, look, these are dedicated spaces where you can park, please go and park here. And after that, we're able to evaluate whatever's happening with that space. We do counts about trip origins, trip destinations, deployments, different type of measures we do over those polygons. This is a picture of something that the County of Arlington was able to switch. So it was a parking spot, and they changed it for the spot for like, right now they have 15 and around 15 bikes and scooters can fit in this space. And we're able to measure the performance of that space with the counts that I mentioned. The last thing that I want to talk about was the key metric about, okay, how do we harness this GPS data, the trace data, and we're able to put it on being able to figure out, okay, what is the trip volume on the streets, right, at the street level. And so this is, for example, an image of the city of Oakland. And as you can see, we have a very large trip volume around Lake Merritt. We have Telegraph going up and down. And we can measure this throughout whatever time they want to look at. So with this, we are helping cities to figure out, okay, where can I produce better or safer infrastructure for the cycling, scooters, bicycling, bike sharing, so on. And also they can download it. All this data that we have is downloadable. So they download it, aggregate, obviously, so that they can go back to the trip data. But they download it and they correlate it with whatever fatalities or injuries they have, geolocated data. So they can begin doing correlations about that. And we also have a speed map that we're working on, so that cities can figure out, okay, where are we having high speeds and where does this correlate with injuries and so on. And so with that, I finished the overview of how Public is basically helping cities harness the KPIs, create them, and help cities towards a better future.
Is it still morning? Good morning, everyone. Do you notice someone up there? That's Danielle Harris, my model, my new mobility model. My name is Clarissa Kavansagan. I work at a nonprofit called Transform. We're located in Oakland, California, but we do a lot of deep local work in San Francisco and Oakland, San Jose, also working at the state level. We've been around for 22 years and have morphed over time because the industry has morphed over time. Part of the reason why all of us are here today. And we believe at Transform that everyone should have access to affordable, frequent, reliable transportation options, including things like bike share and scooter share, and TNC's Uber and Lyft, because we see that as part and parcel to getting people away from solo driving and personal automobile ownership. We also believe that Black and brown communities, low-income communities, are hit first and worst by the climate crisis. And that's where we're focusing a lot of our efforts these days, is in the mobility justice kind of conversation. So it's not a surprise that our urban centers across the board are changing. A lot of affluent people are moving to cities, and it's probably not just San Francisco that's dealing with a housing crisis. The flip side of that is that we're dealing with a displacement crisis. And so people that had the propensity to get onto transit, lower income people who couldn't afford to buy a car, who were left in the inner city with suburbanization, are now being pushed out to to the suburbs in cities across the US. I don't know how it is in Canada, but in the US, you were seeing a lot of this. Low-income people of color being pushed out to the periphery, which a lot of academics call the suburbanization of poverty. That wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a mistake in terms of, sorry, I shouldn't say mistake. It's not a surprise to us that that's the dynamic that's happening. We American planners decided that based on the color of your skin, you got certain resources or did not get certain resources. And so that wealth gap that has been ongoing for generations, the aftermath of racist policies like redlining, racially restrictive covenants with our housing policies as well, have caused us to have this inequality that we're dealing with especially in our urban centers. We've denied or supplied resources based on the color of your skin. That means we need to actually look at this backlog of the lack of resources in order to do equity. So when I say equity, I'm not just talking about future distribution of transportation resources, which is a lot of what analysis focuses on today. It's actually looking back at these past decades of underinvestment. I lead up our Disrupting Inequity initiative, and this is mostly focused on ensuring that shared mobility companies are thinking about the needs of people of color as they drop their tech toys onto our cities. And so I'm gonna blast through a couple of slides, but just to give you a taste of what we're doing in the San Francisco Bay Area, we're looking at these gaps and saying, bike share, great. It has information gaps. So we've done a lot of equity outreach in the community, only to find that people of color, low-income people want to get on bike share. A lot of them don't know about it. They don't know about a very deep discount. That's $5 a year that Lyft currently honors. It was $5 for the second year for unlimited access to the bike share system. If you don't know about that program and are not receiving info from trusted community leaders, then you're probably not going to access it on your own. So we've bridged that gap by working with a lot of grassroots groups to reach the people that otherwise are not plugged into the plenary spaces or know how to go and find the info online. And this was in response to what we saw in the data. The Bay Area was not so different from other cities that got bike share in the kind of later 2000s. This was 2014 data that Berkeley pulled together. Over 50% of people were making $150,000 or more a year. 75% of them were white. Many of them were male. So our approach has been, how do we change these demographics on our bike share ridership? 3% of them were making under 25K in 2014. Today, because of a lot of our work and a lot of pushing on the company and our cities and coming up with good outreach strategies, 22% of our riders on the system are low income. And that's huge. That's a huge shift. And it took all those different stakeholders and players to move this change for almost 5,000 people that are low income on bike share. So that's what's possible when you have the right policy in place and regulation. And honestly, we move that through a public-private partnership. So we see new mobility as instrumental if we're going to move people away from auto ownership and auto dependence, because transit is not functioning 24 hours of the day. There are gaps in our system because of the way we've disproportionately distributed our resources. There are a lot of parts of our cities that don't have good transit service. So where can new mobility come in and actually help us fill the transit gaps? This is directly out of a report from San Francisco that Danielle and Warren worked on a number of years ago, but really urging new companies to go where public sector has not been able to fully provide robust enough service. In Oakland, similarly, we encourage the city to create a shared mobility advisory committee, and out of that process where companies, community leaders, and city staff meet together quarterly, they came up with this very aggressive goal, which is let's get all shared mobility companies to prioritize our Black and brown communities where we know we have this disproportionate impact by poor air quality and transportation cost burden. Let's focus these companies to where we know we have failed our community. And that's pretty bold of a city to go out there and saying that they haven't done well by their Black and brown communities. We need more cities to do this and to encourage private companies to not just go to where the affluent folks are, not just go to where people have choices, but put their investment in places that are actually moving the needle where people have very few options. In the next year or so, we'll be trying to launch this, what we're calling a lending library, a bike lending library with the Scraper Bike team and Lyft. And so even though we've done all this great work on bike share, a lot of the community has mentioned that it's not serving families with children. If I'm under 18, I can't get on bike share. So we're seeing even the gaps in bike share and coming up with a community-driven alternative, which is essentially a lending library with one of our community stakeholders. So can I use the library card to check out a bike that a stakeholder group is actually managing, funded by Lyft? And so I do want to refocus all of this conversation on the reality that these things are not the silver bullet, as Danielle mentioned. We can't just rely on new mobility. It really is dependent on how robust our transit networks are. So we Transform are always, yes, we're moving the needle in the new mobility space, but we're simultaneously helping our congestion management agencies, our region, fundraise for the funding that's required to move people on transit. So we don't see this as one or the other. This is transit as the backbone, robust, frequent, reliable transit, and then putting investments where they matter. And so going back to that earlier map of where investments are not, we want to rectify that backlog, and in doing so, be more equitable in terms of who we are prioritizing. So it's not just focusing all our energy on regulating new mobility, it's seeing where government needs to step up and do what they haven't done, right? So this is the Oakland Bike Plan, which was just adopted in July. And what the city was able to do was show, based on their own analysis, where there are gaps in access to the bike network. So you might have access to bike share, but if you don't have good streets to ride on, if you don't have that infrastructure, it might be moot for you. You're not riding as much because you don't have a safe place to ride. So we got the city to say that, yes, East Oakland, which is very low income, people of color are still in that part of town. It's not as gentrified as other parts of town, which today is only 17% in terms of residents having access to the low stress bikeway network. We're gonna get them to almost 100%. And if you compare that to downtown, right now, 100% of downtown residents have access to the bike network. And so there's not many projects that are slated for downtown. We're putting our projects and our funding to where we know will increase that access. This is a map of the police stops on biking, and so let's not ignore the fact that depending on the color of your skin in America, you have other barriers to getting around by bike or on train, being in public space. And so that is a barrier that we want to call out in our policymaking. How do we make sure that a Black or brown youth from East Oakland feels as comfortable as someone in downtown living in a condo? Those are our struggles these days in our policymaking. This is the first time I think policing is called out so starkly in a bike plan. I mentioned what transit agencies can be doing. The Bay Area has way too many transit agencies. It's extremely difficult to get around by transit if you're moving across county lines. and our fare structures don't speak to one another. So that's the reality of transit. And if we want to make it better for people, we have to see where transit is failing and not just expect that people are going to take the less comfortable option than an Uber or a Lyft. People are choosing TNCs or bike share or scooters because there's something that the current system is not doing for them. Case in point, everyone is still driving, 70% or so driving to work, and this is low-income workers in the Bay Area. So even if you can't afford it, because we've built our cities like this, you're getting that car. Transform is working with our regional agency to think about different or creative approaches to existing infrastructure. So can we create a public Google bus type of model on our highways? We don't have to build rail. We can just figure out how to run more shuttles, more express buses that deal with this long haul commute that people are doing. And perhaps that's easier than trying to get someone on 3 or 4 different transit operators in order to get to work. So can we recreate new transit and use new mobility as that first and last mile kind of solution? And then lastly, we are working with a lot of housing developers. Our Green Trip team works to reduce the parking footprint in residential multifamily. And with new mobility, we see the potential to do a lot more zero parking buildings. This one is in Berkeley. No one can come to this building with their own personal automobile. Everyone gets a bike share membership, a transit pass. There's a car share pod of vehicles that everyone has access to, and a rooftop urban agriculture kind of garden. So that's what's possible when we leverage all this stuff that's happening in the tech space towards reducing housing for cars. We can now take that funding and build housing for people. And I'll skip over a couple other things, but in a nutshell, I think it's helping us also deal with the land use components. This last one is on Telegraph Avenue in Oakland, and Rad Urban has been working with us to do very similar things, which is build in all of this shared mobility options into a development, reduce that parking footprint, and in doing so, reduce solo driving. So, thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm going to talk to you about Cosmic today. We're working to make micromobility for everyone. So I think before I start, a little bit of context and my story. I'm not a transportation expert at all. I see myself much more as a problem solver than anything else. About 3.5 years ago, I took a trip to Colombia, the country, and was meeting a lot of really, really smart people and having a really good time. But what I started noticing was that there were people who were trained in electronics engineering, mechatronics, electromechanical, and most of them were working in administration or marketing or something of the sort. So it dawned on me that very skilled and talented people didn't have opportunity. About 6 months later, I moved to Bogota. I took a house and got a group of engineers together, and part of the compensation package was you got to live for free. We didn't actually know what we were working on, but I knew that I wanted to work on something, right? And there was kind of 2 filters where we had to put our energy into. The first of which was it had to have high social impact, and because we are a business, it had to be a viable business. So that's how we landed on Cosmic. Cosmic ended up being the first shared e-scooters in Colombia. And after doing this and piloting it, we realized that we created the same problem that we wanted to solve, is to bring opportunity to people, but we were only servicing a very small part of the population, people who could actually afford and access these vehicles. So we got a little more meta, and we looked at Latin America as an entire region. And there's about 700 million people living in Latin America. 68% of them have access to smartphones, which was really good news for us because micromobility requires some tech. But 70% of them are unbanked or underbanked. Underbanked means you have very limiting bank accounts, sometimes no debit cards, basically an inability to be a part of the new digital transaction world, even if you have a bank account. And obviously, micromobility these days, especially the free-floating models, requires smartphones with data, so we were good there. But it also requires credit cards or debit cards, so we had a little bit of an issue. Effectively, shared e-scooters and micromobility is not accessible to everyone. It's okay. I mean, that's how technology works in general, right? Everything is a step-by-step process. But it was working against what the original mission was of starting Cosmic and trying to bring opportunity to people who otherwise wouldn't get it. So as a company, we sat together and we said, okay, what are we going to do to solve this problem? And he said, all right, we have the answer. We need a mobility digital wallet, right? That's logical. At least that's what we assumed. And so we built this fancy digital wallet function into our app, and we connected to a bunch of alternate payment methods, cash deposit systems, new bank style systems, digital banking systems. And at the end of the day, the reality was we were still servicing the exact same demographics in the same areas, within the same polygons, in the same operating zones, and we didn't shift what we wanted to do, even though we had a new feature. And on top of that, just listening to the panel, we realized, I'm saying this now, I realized we didn't communicate very well that people had the opportunity to actually access these systems. So it seems like there's a bigger issue at hand, which is trust and communication, right? There's this mainstream assumption that the second and third tier markets that actually do need access to these types of mobility solutions don't have the spending power, or they don't have the enough usage to actually be a part of this and be viable from a business perspective. And it's completely understandable, right? Because I'm coming from the private sector. The other players in the space are all in the private sector, and everyone wants to grow a business as fast as possible. The way you do that, it's a land grab, it's territory, it's user acquisition, and it's the numbers that everyone's looking for. So I'll give you an example. On the left, we have Santiago, which is a metropolitan city in Chile, which has about 6 operators kind of coexisting, all within the exact same zones. And on the right side, we have Viña del Mar, which is a very interesting case study because it has a big floating population of tourism, weekend warriors, and it has an even bigger population of the service industry that's actually supporting all of that. And those are the people who need access to these types of solutions. So the problem wasn't the unbanked, right? The problem was the unserviced. Just huge groups of people that the people bringing the solutions and the companies bringing the solutions to market were overlooking for business reasons or other agendas. What's funny though is, just logically, on-demand vehicle rentals appeals to the cash flow conscious. So the groups of people that we're all avoiding getting in front of are the exact groups of people who actually need this, want this, and do have the spending power to be a part of, because they are very much cash flow conscious. So we had to kind of reevaluate the way we were doing our business. I think all in all, we did a really good job. The first things first, we had to focus on unit economics. Most of shared mobility uses this logic of disposable vehicles, where just blast out as many vehicles as possible, and the vehicle lifespan is extremely short. Industry average tends to be about 2 to 4 months, which is horrendous. A go-kart could last longer than a scooter these days. So we had to put a little bit of attention there, and we made partnerships with Israeli design firms and really good factories in China, and we started producing ruggedized vehicles specifically built for the sharing economy. The second thing was we had to reduce risk. So trust kind of goes hand in hand with the concept of risk. Through our platform, we built a lot of software solutions to prevent theft, vandalism, and we made partnerships with insurance companies to not only protect the value of the vehicles from the operator's perspective, but to also protect the riders who are getting around, because most of these systems don't actually have rider insurance. So let's say you come from an underprivileged community and you get in a car accident or you hit a very high-end car like a Mercedes, who's paying for that? The terms of service typically say you are, as an individual. We started doing live patrol, meaning people were going around and actually stopping and preventing theft and vandalism in real time before it happened. And then finally, real-time network monitoring as well to make sure that we were integrating with our patrollers on the street. And finally, we're a small company. So we didn't raise $100 million, but we have big visions and big ambitions to help service this industry. And so we started recruiting help. And the first place we focused was on local entrepreneurs and businesses who actually knew these areas very well. And we built a kind of franchise model to offload a lot of the operations that they can do way better than we can because they actually understand the nuances of these environments. And then we started looking a little bit higher, and we started working with corporations and startups like Glovo, who has a very similar image to us. Glovo is a last mile delivery service similar to an Uber Eats. They're doing very well throughout the world, but they've made a big business out of entering markets that everyone else is overlooking. Because of this kind of methodology and this change in perspective, now we're accessing 35 unserviced towns and cities around the globe, and we're doing exactly what our goal was. Because ultimately, transportation and opportunity go hand in hand, right? You don't have to put up your hands or anything like that, but just think for a second. When's the last time you lost a job because you couldn't get to work? Or when's the last time you had a major health problem within your family because you couldn't get to the hospital? That's what transportation really represents. And I think through trial and error and a lot of experiences as to what doesn't work, we kind of came back to our roots of bringing opportunity back to those who normally don't get it. Thank you.
Thank you. We don't have 40 minutes, but we still have 25 minutes for discussion. I'm just going to put the Slido slide up for 1 second again. So if you're not yet logged in, here's the instructions. We have a lot of questions. So one of the cool things in Slido is you can actually vote them up. So if you go and vote some of the questions up, I will be able to pick them and ask the panelists. And with that, I need to do, is everybody good with this slide? If not, I'll keep it up for one more minute or so, and then I'll switch. I'll have to get the other screen up so we can see the questions I'm picking. Everybody okay? I'm just taking that as a yes. All right, and then this is presented full screen. Hopefully this works. Yay, okay. Normally, I start with a couple of C questions of my own, but because we have a bit of a short time frame for questions, and there is a lot, I'm just going to start with some of these here. And so the first one, and I know you guys can't see it, so I'm going to read it out. How do we ensure that micromobility does not take over active modes, such as walking and cycling? And I'm going to throw it over to the policy people first, and then over here.
So I would say that I think when we think about the way that all of our freeways were created, like people advocated for those, primarily private business advocated for those, right? So that people would buy their cars. And I think the same thing needs to happen for transit, right? When you truly make transit the spine, then people are innately walking and biking and making those connections in another way. So I don't think it's a huge like rocket science type of thing. Like the reality is like if you buy a car, then you want to try to get as much out of your car as possible and get as many rides as possible out of your car. But then if you move people to transit, they're far more flexible. And so I think that way people are going to walk more. But also I think like going back to, I'm going to continue to hit this button, is the user experience. Like if you make your streets enjoyable to walk on, like people are going to walk. Like my roommates and I, like we'll walk around just like my favorite thing to do on the weekend is no plans. And so I'll be like, hey guys, it's Sunday, I have no plans. And they're like, oh my God, we're going walking. So I think like it's really important to like create an environment that you want to walk in. And so I think a big part of that is like, I think every city hates doing street trees because of the maintenance, right? I think sidewalk expansion is extremely painful because it's so expensive, and then you have to work with all these different departments for the drainage and the sidewalk ramps, and figure out who's going to do that. And so you need to put in these triggers to figure out when utility goes into the pavement, like how do you get those types of bonuses as part of it. And so just thinking about that is really what I'm focused on.
I wanted to crack a joke about how long it takes to find a scooter. You're actually walking a lot to actually find a dockless scooter, especially when you're trying to ride a scooter with friends, right? So all jokes aside, I think that our main goal here is to get people multimodal, right? The more you're comfortable sharing space with strangers, and maybe your Kool-Aid is the TNC ride because you're used to driving your own car, or maybe it's the scooter. And as a bike advocate, I would say that the scooters have reached a lot more people than bike advocacy has been able to reach. And why is that? Why are scooters so popular? It's reaching a very different swath of the population. I can't ignore that as an advocate, and to see that you're turning more people onto this idea of being on the street who would have otherwise been behind the wheel. So how do we leverage this opportunity and create nice places to walk, vibrant places where people want to be on the sidewalk? Because now you have, I will say, and maybe Populous has this data, I do think that the scooters particularly are bringing drivers onto the sidewalk, or drivers have more of an opinion about safe riding than they did in the past when we relegated the bike to the bike lane. So there's this opportunity, there's this opening in policy to actually make those investments happen, because a lot of people are annoyed at the conflicts that a lot more people than normal are annoyed at the conflicts. So how do we take that opportunity towards getting the infrastructure that we want? In the Bay Area, I've been working with 3 different bike coalitions, Bike East Bay, Silicon Valley Bike Coalition, and SF Bike Coalition. And we're recognizing it's better for us to stay in our lane. We're advocacy orgs. Let's go and fight for the bike superhighway. Let's go and fight for that lane to be converted into a bikeway, now that I have the attention of a lot more elected officials who would rather us have less conflict and less crashes. These are things that were not happening 5 years ago without the scooters. So that's the kind of inflection point I see here in terms of putting more funding to biking and walking.
And I'm just gonna combine this with one other question, which is, should micromobility operate on sidewalks, bikeways, roads, or special facilities? Because you just went into that, and I think, I'm just guessing that from a data perspective, you guys have some idea of maybe how you can help cities deal with this question as well.
So I think the question about the active mode and whether they would be pulling from there, I think I like to relate to what happened. I mean, it's early terms. I mean, we don't know actually what's happening. It's been over only a year, right? So we don't know. And I like to think about what happened with bike sharing systems, right? The dock ones, where what they did in cities was not only a mode itself coming in, but they create a culture. So we see, for example, Washington, D.C., where a very large impact long-term they had, the Cabby bike share system, was that it created a culture of cycling. So people, once they got into bike sharing, they said, okay, after several months, I'm gonna get my own bicycle. And so they said, okay, I'm gonna go and buy my own bicycle. So they created a culture about cycling and enforced it. So I think it's early to say what's happening with the scooters. I think it may be that people buy their own scooters, or maybe people will get into the cycling. So I think if you get the enjoyment of cycling, and you have to begin getting infrastructure no, as Clarissa said, that really makes it enjoyable to walking or cycling. Because if it's a pain, any of those two modes, obviously people want to shy away from them. Equally will happen with driving. If you make driving a pain, people would want to get out of the cars and find other modes. So I think there's a push and pull. Always think about TDM, transport demand management, about how can we do this push and pull with different modes so that we can play with infrastructure, the incentives in different geographic space in the city. And in terms of your last question, which was more about how we can track it, well, that's something we're working. We're on whether sidewalks, that's something, I guess it's a policy decision in some cities. We don't dictate policies ourselves. We help cities measure what policies they want to put in place. For example, if it's like, okay, I want you to measure that people are not cycling or not scootering on the sidewalks, we do that. We tend not to get into, okay, this is better than the other. If there are negative externalities to doing so, we can measure that. So for example, if we see that there's more injuries, more fatalities, more complaints, we get it through other KPIs about why you should not be doing this. But we usually don't dictate it unless we go after and see other KPIs, how they interplay with that.
Let's try this. Jonathan, a couple of years ago, I was in Santiago, and people were telling me having a car is kind of the cool status symbol, and there's a bit of a stigma to the biking culture or the active transportation mode. So what have you seen in South America that has worked?
I think actually it's reversed a little bit. Latin America is very big on cycling, very, very big on cycling. It's impressive. Recently this year, a Colombian for the first time, who's a campesino, which basically means he's a farmer, came from a farmer's family and he won Tour de France. And it was like such an inspirational, incredible moment that people who are Colombians that are my friends that I'd never thought I'd see this side of them were calling me and crying like, wow, the country has changed so drastically. And now the status symbol is cycling in most of these countries. I haven't spent much time in all of Latin America, but the countries that I have spent time in, there's a huge hobbyist culture now that exists around cycling. I haven't really seen that walking has been impacted because the best mode of transit, if you have that luxury, is to walk around. I mean, you don't need to go and find a vehicle. You don't need to really rely on anything except yourself. But what I have noticed, as the rest of the panelists have pointed out, is that it's bringing more people to the sidewalks. But it is it's an understandable concern. I don't see a Wall-E future in our upcoming years. I don't see us just kind of like floating around and forcing food down our throats. But no, I don't think it is actually having a negative impact. I think if anything, it's making it more understandable and more believable, right? Because a big part of opportunity is expectations. And sometimes people just don't have the expectations that they can ever access some of this stuff. And now all of a sudden they can access this stuff and they go, yeah, I really like that. I want to change this from just kind of a dip my toes to actually buy one of these vehicles. And now people are saving up money to buy bicycles and scooters and things like that.
So if we're moving to the next question, we're moving back a little bit into the transit realm. And should micromobility replace low-performing transit services? One thing that transit agencies struggle with is how do you serve certain communities when you have less riders? So what's the thoughts there?
I'll start if that's
You
okay.
can-
Yeah. What I love about free-floating micromobility, and this is what I use as kind of our pitch to our franchisees and our partners, is it's ad hoc infrastructure. So if it doesn't work, it's okay to do an experiment. You haven't really invested that much into building kiosks and payment systems and things like that. Technology has helped us to make it way more easy to actually implement these experiments. So I'd say, I'm not really giving a direct answer, but I would say this. Before even addressing it from that perspective, just try it and see what happens. And make it part of the ad hoc infrastructure that's necessary to actually bring these solutions to these types of communities.
So basically, don't pull the bus service. Try first
Yeah,
and see.
try first and see and adapt it and give it enough time. It's funny, I mean, you know this better than me, but a lot of these pilot programs for permits are lasting a year. the reality is for cultural change, you can't really learn much in a year. I mean, it takes sometimes generations to really understand the impacts of things. So just, I'll give the same recommendation that this generation of self-help and mindfulness is giving. Give time, give enough experimentation and enough leeway to learn what the proper methods are.
I think pilots are good. I think doing a pilot, very thoughtful pilot. I'm saying this because I'm thinking about what's happening to some cities, small cities with ride hailing, right? So we saw that some cities, I think, David Sibber, I think, wrote about, I don't know who it was, maybe him, but about a city in Canada, was in Canada, that they stripped their bus system, which was, in more suburban places, in exchange for ride hailing. So basically subsidizing Uber. And that had unintended consequences after, you basically are drawing more people, it costs more, but it's also less efficient because you're moving people in cars. So you don't want to end up in a place like that because you didn't really thought through the consequences. You didn't put the KPIs in place so you measure the steps, what things I want to measure through the pilot 1 year. You don't want to strip your whole bus system also for the pilot because you can't undo these things. It's very difficult. So you have to put pilots in place with the right KPIs and very thoughtful about, okay, I do the pilot, I measure things, so then what do I do next? What happens if I really get a big ridership, which probably they didn't think that would be happening with ride hailing Uber. Now that you have double the ridership and you have to pay for that, what do you do, right? So you have a hole in your budget. So I think, yeah, pilots, but very well thought, and with KPIs around it, it's important.
I do want to pick one more question, maybe two. How do we support equity for people who do not have credit cards or phones in accessing micromobility services? I know, Jonathan, you spoke to the unbanked, but what about the people who don't have a phone, a smartphone?
So I would put that back on the companies at some point. There are ways.
Companies
Do you
always
want?
have text unlock features.
Yeah.
You can't do it from a Railvolution or something, but that's an option. So most of the companies that line does that work there. Have a way that people unlock that way.
Yeah. So is it under the assumption that can someone give me an example of one like TNC, maybe an Uber or Lyft, where you'd need actual payment method in there to access? Because I believe that bike share and scooters have been able to surmount this issue. I think the challenge I mostly see is with the Uber and Lyft requiring a credit card on file. And so how are we overcoming that? We are working with a couple of different pilots in East Oakland, one with the Strategic Growth Council in UC Berkeley, and we essentially have a lot of funding for incentives. We'll figure out how to operationalize this in an app like Uber or Lyft, but I know Lyft has a concierge model. It's not the same kind of call in and you get a ride, but there is a platform that they have where someone manually has to actually arrange the ride. That's something that we're leveraging in our pilot, but it's not the best solution, right? It's not a one-for-one kind of solution to the barrier. So I don't have the answer there. I think there are workarounds it, and I will say the community group that uses concierge that we're piloting a project with has spoken to us about the challenge of I'm sitting at my laptop trying to arrange a ride, and the person who I'm arranging a ride for is miles away, and if they're off by, as this can be the case, if the GPS is off by a little bit, she's having to call on the phone to locate that person. So it's not the perfect solution. We don't know what the solution really is on that front.
Maybe we can end with kind of a fun question around, can you speak more about the role of micromobility in high demand special events? You touched upon that, Danielle, where other modes may perhaps seem more obvious. I think we all in our cities have, sports event and concerts that draw huge crowds, and we have to deal with that. And you've given some examples, but I'd be curious, and that person obviously is also curious to learn a bit more about it.
Yeah, so I will talk about outside lands. So basically what happened is San Francisco Municipal Transportation Agency runs a Muni shuttle for most large special events. And so we have a queue of buses that are just waiting to once one is full, then we'll line up another one. So this is kind of the practice that's going on at the New Warrior Stadium. And so what was found was there was kind of this blame game that was happening. So Uber and Lyft drivers would load where the bus is supposed to be on the route and at the stops. And so the transit division came to me and was like, can you go be the Uber and Lyft whisperer and tell them to move out of my way? And so I was like, okay, let me go have this conversation. And so they were like, there's no loading space. Like, there's no place specifically that we can tell them to go. And so what I did was I found a bunch of commercial corridors that typically close. So everybody, 80,000 people leave at 10 p.m. on a Saturday night in a residential 1 neighborhood. And so many of the commercial districts that are nearby close at 8 p.m. roughly. So I took all of their parking spaces and turned them into passenger loading. And instead of creating this one pickup and drop off area, like if you think about the airport and how painful it is to get a ride there, I dispersed it. So I had a number of satellite locations on the north side and the south side of the park. So Uber and Lyft agreed to put a blackout zone on where the Muni routes were if I put loading zones on these commercial areas. And so I spread them out and I put 6 on each side of the park. And so Supervisor Fuhrer, who is on the north side of the park, typically gets very frustrated because all the congestion is there. So I forced half of the crowd to go to the south side of the park so they could share the pain. And so this is why it was successful. But then I got, at the time, it was Motivates bikes and the Jump bikes to create a corral inside the park. And so by the end of the night, all of the bikes were taken. All of the crowd had dispersed, and because when you have a bunch of hails happening simultaneously, the service is trash. So basically, people can't find their car in the first place, right? So what we were able to do was to get more Muni transit buses through than ever before. We were able to, I included some of the Uber and Lyft's KPIs, which is called the contact rate. How often did the driver or rider have to call each other? And that number dramatically dropped. The completion rate, which is basically whether or not the person got into the car, increased rapidly. And so we didn't really get to talk about this, but I wanted to talk about incorporating new KPIs into the way that we do our work. And sometimes that is their KPI in terms of like a completion rate and things like that. And there's also other things, like I think we're really interested in piloting new mobility, but I think we need to be more interested in piloting transit adaptations and piloting bike infrastructure and putting a bike lane down for a week or 2 weeks and see how people really feel about that. The other thing is, I think for me, when I started biking to work, like I had to have my friend like harass me for a month, and then he came to my house in the morning and he biked me to work. And so I think there really needs to be an onboarding process. Like I was working with the World Refugee Fund, and so they will onboard people onto transit, and I like show them how to get onto transit so that they know how to get to work. And so I think there's a lot of barriers when you go into a transit system. Like the Office of Innovation really didn't do anything sexy. Like we changed signs, we made people talk to each other. One of the projects that I really wanted to do was a whole new wayfinding system. In San Francisco, we have something called inbound and outbound. Nobody knows what that means other than us. And so like this way to downtown, this way to the avenues, right? And so just like simple things. And so I really want to go back to that communicating thing. And so sometimes your innovation or your piloting doesn't even have to be like a mode. Sometimes your innovation will just be like using social media, So at TfL, Transport for London, they have a Twitter handle for every single route. So when the Piccadilly goes down, you just go onto the Piccadilly's Twitter handle, and they'll tell you exactly what what's happening. Because when I was in there, the Twitter people are in headquarters. They're at Central Command, and so Central Command is shouting, but the Twitter people are like putting it down into the Twitter as well. And so like right now, the user demand is so much higher, but the biggest part of user demand is for information. Like, I'm okay waiting for the bus if you tell me it's 5 minutes. I'll actually wait 10 minutes if you tell me it's 5 minutes, right? And so I think there's a lot to be said about communication and really pushing that button really, really hard. And so I just really want to go back to like, think about the things that you already have and how you can pilot within those spaces.
We have about 3 minutes, and you brought the KPIs up, so I'm going to take the opportunity and see if anybody else has any KPI. Like one of our conversation was around, do we need different KPIs to measure success? So I do want to bring that kind of as a closing, and maybe we'll just go one after the other, kind of say a closing statement. Do we need to measure success differently now that we have this new form of mobility?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the topic I've been talking about until now has been social success, and it's very different than a lot of the business agendas that exist. How do we measure the things of whether or not people are thriving? Right? It's a different way of looking at life. We're in a new mode of survival, where the emphasis is on not just whether or not we have access to clean food and water and basic human privileges, but are we doing better as individuals, and are we doing better as a society? And those are really hard KPIs to track. So we're trying to figure that out as a company and understand, are we improving these areas from a human perspective, not necessarily from a numbers perspective.
So I think something that I've been encountering with many cities around the world. I work internationally, and so it's the alignment between the different institutions of the KPIs that they have. So when you talked about the transit agency, and then the city, and then maybe there's a metropolitan planning, an MPO, which is very rare around outside the US or Europe. They have different KPIs that sometimes they conflict with each other. So I think even having a common framework about, okay, well, how are we going to basically measure this geographic region as a whole? What is actually that matters? How we have not conflicting KPIs. So I think that alignment, that framework, that conversation amongst different institutions that operate in the same region, geographic region, I think is very important to happen. And I guess Daniel can talk a little bit about how do you bring those barriers down, but I think that's crucial.
It's hard to boil this down to a KPI. I like to really think about market segmentation, right? What these companies do really well. And we as public sector folks don't really think about the user experience. And do I find enjoyment out of traveling through time and space in my city, right? How could we measure that? Do I have options? And I think maybe even just that particular one, if I'm one person in a part of town that just has one option, that's the metric that I want to see moved. I want that person to have as many options as a person that's affluent living in downtown. If we can't move the needle there, then I don't feel like we're doing our job. The more options you have, the better you are served by the entire transportation network. And you might not use the bus for the majority of your trips, but if I can shift your solo driving, your 100% solo driving to maybe 10% on a bike, I think that that's actually a good shift. And we shouldn't always just be thinking about beefing up existing service for the people who are already served. So how do we get at that disparity in access through better understanding where the lack of options is?
So in 2014, I came back to the SFMTA, and one of the first projects I had was the Bike Comfort Index. And so is it a buffered bike lane? Is it buffered with a car? Is it just buffered with a 5 feet space? And so I went through all of the bikeways within San Francisco to assess them. And I really wondered, why did we not do this on transit? So something I'm really passionate about, and Clarissa has really helped me out with, is the pink tax. Is talking about your experience on transit. And so I fought really hard to get pedestrian lighting in a neighborhood that was really dependent on transit. Pedestrian lighting isn't something that's typically handled by the transit agency. It's typically with the Public Works. And so to find transit funds for pedestrian lighting is very difficult, which is really stupid, right? If you think about it, you want people to walk. Like, obviously you want them to be able to see when they walk. But also, like, there's clear associations, right? When a retailer is lighting their business, the choice of fluorescence, right, versus blue light versus yellow light, right, really will tell you how much someone will buy. Like when you go into the Apple store, you're like, oh my God, I want to buy everything, right? And so a lot of that has to do with the lighting in the room. And so just thinking about what is the comfort index within your lighting, like I'm always going into a transit station and I'm like, man, how am I going to get out of here if something happens? How many dark corners are there? Where am I not going to stand? Can I watch my back? Is there a wall, right? And so I think there's a lot to assess just based on that experience. Something else is I have a few friends that have wheelchairs, and so going into a transit station with them is a whole new experience. And so I think a lot of things that we don't need new toys, new tools to figure this out. I think you need to have a high level of empathy and understanding and a willingness to try new things. And so I really don't think that this is rocket science. I think the KPIs is really like, take your auntie, take your popo, your gongong, your tio, your tia, and go into a transit station and listen to all the things that they don't like about it, and that's really going to tell you the things that you need to change.
All right, well, with that, we're closing our session. Thank you for being here. Thank you all for coming out.